Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second Juan Laurel Endowment in the Humanities Lecture. My name is Anna Marie Avicilia.
And my name is Bernard Caslib, and we are your MCs for tonight's event. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge and thank all for being here. We have attendees from De La Salle University, University of the Philippines, University of Asia and the Pacific, the Far Eastern University, the Ateneo de Davao University, De La Salle College of St. Benilde, and people watching us from abroad. And of course, our own students, faculty, and staff from Ateneo de Manila University.
The annual lectures are made possible, as Dr. Chua said, by the Juan Laurel Endowment Fund in the Humanities, established in 2019 through two donations, one from Mr. Rodney Juan Laurel, CEO of AcuPoint Systems, and another from Mr. Robertson Juan Laurel, CEO of Sunfu Solutions Incorporated. This is in honor of their parents, Roberto and Erlinda, and for the benefit of the School of Humanities, Ateneo de Manila University. Mr. Robbie Juan Laurel is here with us tonight. Let us thank him for his generosity and magnanimity, without which this event would not have been possible at all. Everyone, let's give him a round of applause, please.
So now, ladies and gentlemen, the woman of the hour, let me introduce our speaker for this afternoon. Edith Hall is a professor of classics at Durham University, United Kingdom. She is the author of Investing the Barbarian, Greek Self-Definition Through Tragedy. Greek Tragedy, Suffering Under the Sun, and Aristotle's Way, How Ancient Wisdom Can Change Your Life, among others. She is also the co-editor of Women Classical Scholars and Greek and Roman Classics in the British Struggle for Social Reform. She appears frequently on television and radio in the United Kingdom, where the topic is the classics, and as a consultant at various professional theater companies. Her latest book is People's History of Classics, Class and Greco-Roman Antiquity in Britain, 1689 to 1939, co-authored with Henry Steed. She was recently elected to a fellowship of the British Academy. Ladies and gentlemen, let us give a big, warm round of applause, Dr. Edith Hall.
Thank you for that wonderful welcome, Anna-Marie and Bernard. And Bernard, thank you for chauffeuring me around, negotiating the quite extraordinary Manila traffic with such expertise. I would like to thank everybody who's come. I'd like to thank everybody who's tuned in online, which certainly includes people in my own country and many friends in Greece. Excuse me. I would particularly like to thank Jonathan Chua and PJ Strebel for initiating the whole administration of the lecture and the seminar yesterday. We had a wonderful seminar run by the philosophy department. I'd like to thank everybody there. But above all, Mr. Robbie Juan Laurel, without whom I would not be here physically. I wouldn't actually be here at all, even online. A very generous endowment, which I think is actually an inspired initiative helping to bring Philippines and the rest of the world into more harmonious dialogue. Will you be changing my PowerPoint when I ask? Thank you. So let's begin with one of the most notorious sentences in Aristotle's entire body of work. And that's what he says in his Poetics about the appropriate characterization of female characters in Greek tragedy. He prescribes 4 things for the aspiring tragedian to aim at in characterization. All characters should be good, appropriate, realistic, and consistent. In the second category, fittingness or appropriateness, he says this. Could we go back, please? That's not it. Thank you. That's the one after that. Okay, this is what he says. A character may be brave, but it's not fitting for a woman to be brave or clever. Now, this always surprises and even annoys the reader, and not only because in the 21st century, and indeed long before, we don't agree with Aristotle that either bravery or intelligence is confined to the male sex. There's another problem. There are several amongst the 30 or so tragedies which have survived to be studied in modernity, which just don't conform with Aristotle's recommendation here. Clytemnestra in Aeschylus Agamemnon stands up to the chorus of male citizens and says she's willing to fight against them all single-handedly. Can I have the picture of Clytemnestra, please? No, this is not working. Okay, we're not going to do the PowerPoint. Medea acts autonomously against the royal family of Corinth and Jason and risks arrest by the Corinthians in order to stop them humiliating her. Antigone risks her life to bury her brother in defiance of her tyrannical uncle Creon's edict. Now, all 3 of these women seem intelligent and articulate as well. And there are many others. Io in Prometheus, Electra in plays by all 3 tragedians, Antigone and Ismene in Oedipus at Colonus by Sophocles, and many of Euripides' women show either courage or intelligence, or both, Alcestis, Hecuba, Jocasta in Phoenician women. Clytemnestra and Agamemnon, Medea and Jason, Creon and Eurydice, all 3 tragedians portrayed troubled marriages that engender brutal and untimely deaths. Fear of male domination and or rape underlie the predicaments of Antigone and later Ismene and Antigone, but also the Danaids fleeing forced marriage in Aeschylus' Suppliants, the women of Troy awaiting allocation to Greek masters in Trojan women, and the terrified captive Iole in Women of Trachis. Female choruses have conflicted relationships with male rulers in 7 Against Thebes, Bacchae, and Sophocles' Electra. Orestes assaults his Aunt Helen and cousin Hermione, thank you so much, in Euripides' Orestes. So conflict between the sexes is a fountainhead of suffering in the majority of Greek tragedies. Oh dear. Don't know what's happened. So the prominence of such conflict is inseparable from the prominence of women. And the ancient Greeks were already uncomfortably aware of how prominent women were in the tragic stage. There are more females than males in these plays, remarked a character in a treatise in the 2nd century AD. And a novel of similar date, there's a whole discourse on the large number of plots which women have contributed to the stage. Only one tragedy, Sophocles' Philoctetes, contains no women, and female tragic choruses outnumber male in a ratio of more than 2 to 1. Now, since women were almost excluded from Athenian public life, it's seen as a paradox that they were so conspicuous in this most public of Athenian art forms. So, several explanations of this paradox are customary. Women's role in religion, especially lamentation and sacrifice, must partly explain their presence in a genre where death and killing are central focuses. Other scholars see the Dionysiac origin of tragedies explaining the emphasis on the feminine. Bacchic frenzy often occurs in metaphors associated with kin killing in tragedy because of its affiliation with the cult of Dionysus. Frommozyklin refers us to the femininity of Dionysus, transvestism in his cult, and symbolic gender inversion in Greek ritual to help explain the role of women as the other of the masculine self, which is what is truly at stake in the theatre. And anthropology, symbolism, suggests that cultures often use female figures to help them imagine their social order, even when they're not very visible in public. Also, medically, women were regarded as more susceptible to invasive passions than men, so particularly plausible vehicles through which to explain the occurrence of tragic events and effective in the generation of emotional responses in the audiences. So, with all these women, how are we going to explain what Aristotle says about women not being shown as brave or clever? My first approach will be to look at his language in more detail. The translation I gave above, that women shouldn't be brave or clever, is one of several possibilities. First, the word for bravery. Now, this is the adjective andreios. A woman shouldn't be characterized as andreios. But most Greeks would have agreed with Aristotle because the root meaning of this term is simply masculine or manly. A man is an aner, genitive andros. The quality that makes him so is masculinity, andreia. Clothing can be andreos, or quarters in a house. So it is logical that a woman shouldn't be depicted as andreos, for andreia is the very quality that makes a man a man. We could equally well translate Aristotle's prescription for female tragedies in character in tragedy as it being inappropriate for a woman to be shown as masculine. And in fact, both Clytemnestra and Medea are indeed depicted in language, sometimes very explicitly, that equates them with men. Antigone isn't. She may be very brave in our sense of the word, but she's not accused anywhere of behaving like a man. The problem lies in the frequent metaphorical use in ancient Greek of andreos to mean strong, vigorous, courageous, physically. The Greeks thought physical courage was by nature a masculine quality, but not all men have it. Herodotus distinguished men with manly strength and men with a soft and effeminate disposition. When the historian Thucydides relates the civil war in Corcyra, that's Corfu, in 427 BC, he says there's a battle in the streets when the women and the slaves on the side of the Democrats joined in the actual fighting. Amazing sentence. He says, the women entered the fray with great daring, hurling down tiles from the rooftops, standing up to the din with a boldness, he doesn't say Andrea, boldness that went beyond what was natural to their sex. Paraphusin. And even Aristotle assumes in his Poetics that women can possess Andrea, though in lesser degree than men. He says that Andrea is different in a man and a woman, since a man would be thought a coward if he only had the degree of Andrea that a brave woman had, so it's a matter of quantity. Aristotle did not deny that women can have the masculine quality of bravery, it's just that they don't have it in anything like the same degree as a brave man. So what about Aristotle's word for clever? He conspicuously does not use the several terms he could have done that mean intelligence in a positive way, including that beautiful prayer from Plato, where being wise in a good way is sophos. We just had that word. He doesn't use sophos. He doesn't use xunetos, which means with good understanding or comprehension.
Recording in progress.
Good. He doesn't use phronimos, which means sensible, practical, good sense. The word he uses is deinos. In Euripides' Medea, in the opening speech, Medea's nurse says she fears Medea may resort to killing because she's deiner, And this means something like frighteningly powerful or dreadfully resourceful or simply dangerously capable. So translating Aristotle as clever is extremely misleading because deinos normally implies something negative or more negative. Its root is connected with the Greek word deos, meaning terror or fearful awe. By a metaphorical slippage, deinos came to mean, just like our English terribly or awfully, that someone was awfully good or terribly skillful at something, like speaking in public. And nobody would describe Antigone as danae, although they do describe Medea as such, and as we shall see later, Clytemnestra is characterized as having an awfully powerful intellect. So I hope we've come to a slightly better understanding of what Aristotle meant by thinking about his precise choice of vocabulary. We could equally well translate that notorious sentence as meaning that women should not be portrayed as masculine or dangerously able. It's also important to remember the first of Aristotle's 4 prescriptions for character drawing in tragedy, the one which he says is by far the most important, and that's that a character should be good, Christos. The root meaning of this word is actually useful or fit for purpose, so beneficial to others and the community, being good at being a woman or good at being a man for the community. And he says that this kind of goodness is relative indeed to each category or class of people. A woman can be good, so can a slave, even though women are inferior to men, and slaves, he says, not even worth thinking about. He objects to all plays in which characters are unnecessarily morally bad. And he identifies as an example the really venal, disloyal, and opportunistic Menelaus of Euripides, Orestes. But this point is extremely important. Aristotle has a vision of the right kind of tragedy, and it's a tragedy in which people who are basically morally good come to harm. We'll go on to look at this vision of tragic heroes who are morally decent people in more detail. But we need to note that Aeschylus' Clytemnestra and Euripides' Medea would not be acceptable on the count of the first criterion of characterization, that is moral virtue. That's completely regardless of whether they're men or women. They're just bad. Clytemnestra and Medea both are immoral, and they knowingly commit terrible crimes. Our tragic heroines under discussion then, out of them, only Antigone again passes Aristotle's test of being basically a moral agent driven by good principles. But that adverb knowingly is crucial. Aristotle makes an interesting distinction between crimes and calamities that involve conscious planning of evil and those that come about through ignorance or are only just averted in the nick of time. He much prefers this type of plot where characters are doing something they don't understand what they're doing. He felt it's compatible with his ideal that characters in tragedy should be basically Christos, or good. And he cites a sadly lost play in which the queen, Merope, had concealed her son and sent him away for safety when her kingdom was conquered. She concealed Iphitus far away in Arcadia. When he returned seeking vengeance on the king who'd usurped him, she doesn't know who he is, and she nearly kills him, her son, in ignorance, but fortunately discovers who he was. Aristotle says this is the newer type of tragedy in the 4th century and requires great skill to engineer the plot that way. Let's find Merope. There she is. He also admires the same type of near-fatal mistake in Euripides' Iphigenia in Tauris. Iphigenia nearly kills her brother Orestes because she doesn't know his identity, but does discover it just in time. Aristotle loves this type of plot. As he sees it, it's much better than the older ones. And as an example of the older ones, he offers, guess what? Medea, where the playwright makes his characters act consciously, badly, and knowing the facts. Euripides makes his Medea kill her children after saying, I know exactly what I'm doing. In chapter 13 of the Poetics, Aristotle makes clear this understanding of basic virtue as necessary to his ideal tragic protagonist. The tragic hero should not deserve his misfortune. He shouldn't be outstandingly virtuous, but just a basically good man, like Aristotle's assumed readers, who makes some kind of mistake. He does not suffer because of vice or villainy. He falls through some error, hamartia. Now, it can be a mistake of fact. Oedipus was mistaken about the identity of his parents. It can be a mistaken action. Creon was definitely mistaken to outlaw the burial of Polynices. But actually, both Oedipus and Creon are basically good men. Praestoi. The difference is Oedipus is extremely clever, Creon is extremely stupid. But they are trying to do their best for their communities. They're not only good, but men, and not only men, but aristocrats. Because a tragic fall is most tragic, says Aristotle, when the fall is from high estate. Subsequently, Aristotle provides a handy list of the characters he deems suitable. And guess what? They're all men. Alcmaeon, Oedipus, Orestes, Meleager, Thyestes, and Telephus. So we need to see what Aristotle says about women in tragedy in the context of his whole project, which is prescriptive, not descriptive in the Poetics. His aim is to advise aspiring tragedians on how to write the best kind of tragedy as he sees it, not to describe retrospectively the body of tragedies well over 1,000 by his time, which had already been written. He wants to create a template for the best kind of tragedy in accordance with his entire intellectual project, which encompasses not only aesthetics and literature, but also, amongst others, ethics, politics, rhetoric, and natural sciences. So 2 points I'm going to make. First, his views on tragedy and the representation of men and women in it are the representation of men and women in it are a fairly direct response to Plato's views that he puts in Socrates' mouth about tragedy in the Republic. And the second point I'm going to make is that he had a natural scientist's and ethicist's understanding of the differences between the genders. One of the few virtues he does see women as excelling men in is in philia, or love, especially within the family, not sexual love. He'd never have written in Poetics that women should not be shown as loving in an asexual sense. And that will lead us into our conclusion to the specific tragedies with prominent women in them that Aristotle discusses with approval in his Poetics. So first, it's important to recognize that unlike his teacher Plato, Aristotle thoroughly respected the theatre and regarded it as useful to the education of citizens and the life of the flourishing polis or city-state. His Poetics can be seen as a riposte to Socrates' request in the Republic for a treatise which does demonstrate that poetry other than hymns to the gods and encomia of worthy men could be useful to communities as well as pleasurable. Plato's Socrates, although admitting that he's reluctant to take such an extreme step, concludes the only option is to exclude all mimetic representational poetry, including tragedy, from his Republic. Really boring nightlife they were going to have in Plato's Republic. But he makes the concession of challenging those who disagree with them to formulate a defense. It's in Book 10. Okay, we should allow the champions of poetry, men who don't practice the art themselves, but are lovers of it, to offer a prose defense on its behalf, showing that poetry is a source not only of pleasure, but also of benefit to civic communities. Now, Plato's thought to have written that Republic between 380 and 360 BC. And from 366 onwards, one of his best students, I would argue by far his best student at the Academy in Athens, was the young Aristotle. Goes there at 17, stays to 37. One way of thinking about Aristotle's Poetics, actually probably not written until his residence in Athens, his second residence, between 335 and his death in 322, I think it's just a direct response to that challenge. The young Aristotle is sitting in Socrates' lecture hall when he bans poetry from the Republic, but says, come on, boys, you try to defend it in a prose treatise. Aristotle says, I will. So Plato was refining his arguments against the inclusion of theatre in the ideal state, and these are recorded in books 2, 3, and 10 of the Republic. And Plato puts into the mouth of Socrates a series of objections to the effects of tragic theatre. Actually, he includes Homeric poetry in that category. All literature and art, says Socrates, is fundamentally problematic because it's not real. Since Socrates believes there's a realm of immaterial ideas which is only imitated in our physical world, the world perceptible to us through our senses, then artistic representation of the perceptible world must be especially fallacious or false, because it's not at one but two removes from the eternal world of ideas. It's an imitation of an imitation. Secondly, Socrates objects to the way that the arts depict gods behaving immorally, vindictively, and changing their natures during metamorphoses. He also complains that arts encourage a fear of death by painting a grim picture of the underworld. And finally, he thinks that empathizing with grief-afflicted people or imitating them nourishes the very parts of the soul which the guardians of the ideal republic must repress. It encourages the sorts of unmanly, uncontrolled emotional behavior which the guardians need to avoid. But the most compelling of these four arguments of Socrates against theatre does relate to its status as the representation of life, a mimesis performed by people as distinct, for example, from a mimesis constituted by a painting. In a famous passage, Socrates considers in dialogue with Adimantos the actual training of the future guardians of the Republic. But if the guardians imitate, that's from the verb imitate related to mimesis, if they should imitate from childhood what's appropriate to them, that would be men who are brave, sober, pious, free, and all of those kinds of virtues. But things unbecoming the free man, they should neither do nor be clever at imitating, nor yet any other shameful thing, lest from the imitation they imbibe the reality. Have you noticed that imitations, if continued from youth into life, settle down into habits and nature in body, speech, and thought? Yes, indeed. So we'll not allow our charges, whom we expect to prove good men, being men, to imitate a woman, young or old, reviling her husband, challenging the gods, boasting about good fortune, or grieving and lamenting when struck by misfortune, or ill, or erotically fixated, or in childbirth. Certainly not. So, the imitation of other people behaving in ways unsuitable to guardians must not be allowed. The reason is that sooner or later, the imitators internalize those imitated behaviors and their own fundamental natures are transformed. And the first specified undesirable behaviors are all designed by Plato to remind the reader of famous tragic heroines. Medea, Niobe, Phaedra. In another notorious tragedy by Euripides, Cannae had actually given birth in the play and to a baby fathered by her brother. pictures of that. That was the challenge. That was Cannae killing herself shortly after giving birth. Now, Plato returns to the topic of manliness and tragedy in Book 10, where he threw down that gauntlet to anyone who wanted to defend tragedy to do it in prose. Here he argues that tragedy feeds the irrational and emotional part of the soul. A good man, he insists, should bear up against the pain inflicted by, for example, the death of a son. In the theatre, he says, if we abandon ourselves to sympathizing and lamenting with a man weeping for the loss of a son, we're behaving in a way that befits not a man, but a woman. Now, Aristotle's incredibly brilliant response to this last objection is his theory of catharsis, that by watching people suffer and pitying them, we can actually somehow cleanse or rid ourselves or train harmful emotions. But his response to the charge that tragedy represents not only undignified and out of control women, but men effeminizing themselves by excessive emotion is different. He wants tragedy that doesn't show immoral women, or indeed anyone immoral, as we've seen. He wants tragedy about morally good enough people who make mistakes. He even provides a list of suitable men, as we've seen, to act as protagonists. In particular, he sees as perfectly appropriate to tragedy what we would call a happy ending, where heavy lamentation is in the end avoided altogether. And this is why he so admires the Iphigenia in Tauris of Euripides. I do recommend reading. There's emotional tension, there's moral virtue, there's a terrible mistake of fact. Iphigenia doesn't recognize her brother, but there is no dreadful tragedy which would encourage huge wallowing in lamentation by the male spectators at the theatre. This play is one of his very favourites and can help us understand the type of woman who should be represented in tragedy. I actually wrote an entire book about it, which is free to download on my website. He's already singled out this play for the highest praise earlier in his crucial discussion of the ways in which the emotions proper to tragedy, fear and pity, are best aroused. Iphigenia in Tauris, which is actually Sebastopol, Crimea, is placed in the very top category, and actually this time ahead of Oedipus, usually his favourite play. Aristotle says it represents the sort of action which best produces these emotional reactions of pity and fear. He says by far the best way of arousing pity and fear is from the inner structure, the plot of the piece, rather than spectacular means. The violence which produces the fear and pity is best when it's between close family relations. Aristotle then considers in detail the circumstances which strike us as terrible or pitiful, and he divides those into 4 categories. First, the action may be done consciously. That's not good. And here Aristotle gives the example of Medea. Secondly, the action can be done in ignorance and the bond discovered afterwards, as in Oedipus. He kills his father, sleeps with his mother, but doesn't know who they are. Thirdly, the action may be about to be done consciously, but is somehow averted. And here Aristotle doesn't actually come up with an example. But the 4th case is when someone is about to do an irreparable deed through ignorance and makes the discovery before it is done. And he says that the runner-up, second prize, silver medal, is Oedipus, but the very best case is the last one, as when Merope is about to kill her son, but recognizing who he is, doesn't kill him. And in the Iphigenia in Tauris, the sister recognizes the brother. He regards as supreme the type of tragic plot in which the audience is prepared for the imminent prospect of intrafamilial violence through misunderstanding about identity, but doesn't actually have to go through it. So Euripides' tragedy about the reunion of Iphigenia and Orestes in Tauris was very far from being a problem with its happy ending to Aristotle. He analysed tragedies not according to their ending, but the emotional effects they produced in the audiences during the process of enactment. Euripides' Iphigenia in Tauris, he says, is an example of the best possible practice, not only in terms of its wonderful organic anagnorisis or recognition scene, but its arousal of pity and fear. On the criterion of emotional effectiveness, the plot of this play is perfect. And the prominent position held by this play in Aristotle's consciousness as he worked out his theory of tragedy is further underlined by the section in which he gives practical advice to the aspiring playwright on dramaturgical method. And he actually gives you a summary of the entire play. A girl is sacrificed, disappears inexplicably from the sight of the people performing the sacrifice. She's transported to another land where it's the custom to sacrifice foreigners to the goddess. She holds this office. After some time has passed, the priestess's brother happens to arrive. The fact that the god, for some reason, told him to go there, that's to get a statue of Artemis, and the reason for it are extraneous to the plan of the play. He arrives, is arrested, and just when about to be sacrificed, reveals his identity. And it's actually by reading out a letter. So the second place to look for illumination of Aristotle's views on women in tragedy is less his work as a response to Plato, but in his own views on relationships between the genders in his other works. Now, there's a lot of fascinating work on biology, his grounding in natural science and biology of gender differentials, brilliantly written about by a British colleague called Professor Sophia Connell. But I'm going to focus on the first book of his Poetics, where he talks about the right relationship between male householders and womenfolk. He definitively rules that men should rule women because men are by nature better suited to leadership than female, and because they hold seniority over women and they are more developed. It's not my experience. He anticipates any counterexamples which might be offered of instances where women have proved themselves suited to leadership over men, like Artemisia, Queen of Caria. He says they're just freaks, they're contrary to nature. Male rule over women is founded in nature. Any subversion of this natural hierarchy deviates from nature. The necessity for men to rule women is reflected in the constituent parts of the soul. Men are naturally superior to women. Crucial this, in the capacity for deliberation. Deliberation doesn't just mean decision-making. It means decision-making and taking advice and consulting others. It's a collective thing. Now, no passage in ancient Greek or Roman literature has exerted more influence on subsequent justifications of patriarchy than that sentence. Its influence can be clearly traced from the Church Fathers and Thomas Aquinas to Hegel, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche. But Aristotle's argument is actually more dense and subtle than usually thought. In recommending that the rule of men over women should be like that of a magistrate of a city-state, rather than that of a king over his subjects or a master over his slaves, he is acknowledging that male-female relationship is less asymmetric than the father-child relationship or the master-slave relationship. Women are to be like citizens of a city-state in some respects, but they're to be excluded from the right ever to rule as magistrates and thus exercise executive power. Yet women again are distinguished from children and slaves. They do have some capacity for deliberation, but it lacks authority. We'll go on to that. Now, since even free women in all ancient Greek city-states were excluded from most dimensions of public and political life, not religion, but political life, it's to be expected that Aristotle would regard women as incapable of the most of the activities in which he expects male citizens to engage. He criticizes harshly, while borrowing extensively from Plato's Republic, Statesmen and Laws. His own politics is intended to guide rulers and statesmen, and that reflects the high political circles in which he has moved, especially in Macedon. Although in his Republic, Plato had discussed many of the topics which are to be explored in Aristotle's Politics, the latter is the first extant treatise entirely devoted to political philosophy. Plato had envisaged the possibility that in a hypothetical ideal republic of the future, in his day entirely non-existent, there could be women amongst the enlightened oligarchy or guardian, trained on account of their philosophical ability to participate as equal members of the professional ruling class. But Aristotle is not concerned with hypothetical futures. He wants to define an achievable household shared by men and women, and he offers argued justifications for the nature of the relationship between them. Yes, please. Book 1 of the 8 in the Politics starts by defining political theory as the study of the sovereign city-states, a political community, a partnership. Thank you so much. The partnership of citizens pursues a common good or end, a telos, that's virtue and happiness, both on an individual and a collective level. He refutes the popular view, thank you, that political rule is just like any other kind of rule, whether over kings over their subjects or masters over slaves. And he describes how city-states have evolved historically from two fundamental human partnerships between people who can't exist without one another, and that involves things like trade, and those between men and women, which is indispensable for human reproduction, and that's imperative because people like to leave behind them someone else like themselves. And this partnership of man and wife joins to form a household to meet the practical needs of life. These households then join other family households to create villages, and eventually villages come together with other villages and form the city-state. And the city-state reaches a greater level of self-sufficiency than is possible in a small village. Although it originally evolves because it's easier to create conditions that support life in a partnership of several villages, it achieves something new. The goal of just staying alive is replaced by the goal of living well. That does not mean living pleasurably, but living in accordance with virtue to achieve the chief end of humans, which is eudaimonia, and to become the best possible version of ourselves. Ethics and politics are inseparable because a well-run city-state is one which makes it possible for all its citizens to lead good lives. So this polis is a natural organism rather than a man-made cultural artifact. The city-state exists by nature, and man is by nature a polis animal. I'm not going to say political. It's a conurbation animal. In the establishment of male-female and master-slave partnerships, nature was aiming at the formation of city-states, the optimal context for all humans who have some qualities which set them apart from other animals. And those qualities include speech, reason, and the ability to distinguish good from bad, beneficial from harmful, just from unjust. Humans pass laws to ensure that justice is upheld, support the pursuit of virtue, which is more important than the pursuit of wealth or even security. So Aristotle has moved then to a discussion of the management of the household, the oikos, where much production and processing of things we need, food and clothes, takes place. Aristotle finally turns to the proper governance of women and children. And he says there's a qualitative difference between a man's rule over his family members and his slaves because the former are free. But there's also this crucial difference between the way a man rules his wife and his children. He rules his wife as a citizen. He is quite clear, as a citizen, and his children as a monarch, because the male is better suited to leadership than the female, and the senior and more developed person is more suited to leadership than the younger and the more immature. So Aristotle's envisaging a situation in which a female is not as well suited to leadership as a male. For Aristotle, what distinguishes the ruling householder from all other members of the household is that he has a fully developed rational faculty, which consists of the ability to deliberate and come to reasoned decisions about action. And the word for deliberation, boulieuesthai, a middle form, which means it's something you do with other people. Now that comes from the same root as the Greek word for the council in the city-state, the boule, where the role was to deliberate about how the community should act. From any household, only the ruling male, thinks Aristotle, is capable of that deliberation. And that justifies his rule at home and his eligibility to participate in power in the public sphere. Now, deliberation is an enormously important topic in Greek ethics long before Aristotle. It was widely held to be something of which women were completely incapable. There was even a proverb, don't deliberate with a woman. There's also, don't deliberate drunk. But Aristotle does not yet deny the capacity to deliberate to women and children altogether, as he does to slaves. Oh, it's not even working now. This doesn't even work now. In children, that capacity, that's a Figenarian terrace. It's one before, please. No, next one. Okay. In children, the capacity to deliberate, tot bouleutikon, is undeveloped, but exclusively in boys, it does have a potential to become fully mature as the boy grows up. In women who were envisaged as somehow suspended in a permanent state of immaturity relative to men, it is described not as undeveloped, but as lacking authority. Please, could I get the other slide with this sentence on? That's the last slide. There we go. The female has it, but without authority. Now, the adjective Aristotle uses here, akuros, is one of the most debated in Greek philosophy. It's the opposite of kurios, which means having power, having authority, being entitled, decisive, ordained, ratified, trustworthy, lawful, valid, and even authentic. This means that Aristotle is saying that women's deliberative faculty means one or more of the following: powerless, lacking authority, unentitled, indecisive, not ordained, unratified, untrustworthy, not grounded in law, invalid, or inauthentic. It's not clear whether he means the capacity is there but not acknowledged in any lawful way, or whether it can't be acknowledged in any constitutional way because it is by nature untrustworthy and indecisive. Now, there are scholars who want to argue that Aristotle is, for a man of his time, enlightened about women, and they tend to favour the former interpretation. My own view is that he really did believe women's deliberations to be untrustworthy and decisive. And that is why women could not be given entitled to be recognized as fully equal citizens with men and help run it in the assembly and the council, either in the miniature city-state of the household or the polis institutions. The word kurios, used as a noun, also denoted the legal position of a male guardian over a female. All citizen women in classical Athens had to have a kurios. It's the same word as Kyrie, my lord. Her father, until she was married, her husband, or in the absence of either a husband or a father, next her brother, next her maternal uncle, next her paternal uncle. And the kurios was responsible for providing for her, but also had huge power over her. He also publicly represented her interests, if required, in financial dealings and the courts of law. Women's souls and minds, like their persons, needed a kurios, male authority, to validate any decision they might come to, actions they might essay. Yet, women are not to be subordinated to the absolute sovereignty which characterizes a man's relationship with his children. Aristotle is certainly giving women a more consequential role in suggesting that a wife's relationship with her husband bears at least some comparison with the relationship between two equal citizens. Now, this passage in Aristotle, while clearly justifying the exclusion of women from the political sphere, has nevertheless found defenders, even amongst recent scholars, who would never condone women being oppressed in the modern world. Some point to Aristotle's theory, especially in his natural biology, of the complementarity of the sexes. And that's in his zoology as well as his ethics. In Nicomachean Ethics, he states that justice in the household is different from political justice according to the way that offices are assigned. He says, in the household, responsibilities are assigned in recognition of the complementarity of the sexes. Different skills, he says later in Politics, are required under the heading of household management from men and women. Men go out and acquire goods, women guard and preserve them with vigilance. Other apologists for Aristotle's view of women point to his statement that both women and children must be educated in a way which promotes the well-being of the city-state as a whole. Since for a community to be excellent, it needs to have excellent women and children. They also point, rightly, to Aristotle's recommendation concerning the appropriate ages at which men and women should marry in order to maximize conjugal harmony. He does think it's better that a husband and wife reach the end of their fertility at the same time, and that requires men marry women considerably younger, at least 20 years. But he also recommends that women marry later than was the usual practice in the Greek world. Most city-states, it was common at 13. He suggests 18, and that is to aid procreation. It seems he believed quite correctly that it's far less dangerous for an older teenager to carry a child than one who's just started her periods. But it also, he says, to enhance women's moral excellence. The other significant evidence used by apologists for Aristotle's attitude to women compare him with Plato. They point out that although Socrates imagines the hypothetical possibility that a few women might have philosophical talents, the general tenor of remarks on women throughout Plato is far more derogatory and demeaning than in Aristotle. The younger philosopher, it's been suggested, at least envisages a real contemporary marriage in which the wife can attain excellence, crucial to the flourishing of the house. The issue of deliberation is crucially important in tragedy as well. When most tragic women are shown deliberating, it ends in disaster. Clytemnestra notoriously is said to be a woman who deliberates like a man by the Watchman, actually uses that word, the bool word, but her deliberations have led her to adultery and now to murder of the innocent Cassandra, as well as the guilty and previously unpunished Agamemnon. Medea's deliberations make her change her mind no fewer than 5 times in 5 minutes, until she finally declares, my ability to deliberate, she uses that word, has been conquered by my anger. Antigone doesn't deliberate. It's intuitive. She's simply convinced that she must act on her love for Polynices as her brother, her philia. I was not born to hate, but to use philia, she says. In not deliberating, in acting out of philia, yet again she passes Aristotle's ultimate test for suitability as a woman for representing in tragedy. So, we're getting near the end. Unlike his teacher Plato, Aristotle thoroughly respected the theatre and regarded it as useful in the education of citizens, the life of the flourishing city-state. His Poetics, I think, is a response to Socrates' request in the Republic for a defense of tragedy. But in the Politics, Aristotle also places leadership of a chorus in a list of civic offices which are highly significant, second only after priests and before heralds and ambassadors. He thinks theatre is essential. He's given a great deal of thought to the kind of musical harmonies and rhythms that should be used in the theatre and their emotional effects on people. And he says that people of all social classes need to be given access. I think he was what he himself calls in the Nicomachean Ethics a philotheoros, an individual who takes enormous pleasure in shows, spectacles, especially theatrical ones. Near the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics, he distinguishes the different things in which different people take pleasure, commenting that the Greeks used compound words beginning with the prefix philo, lover of, to describe such individuals. Men who enjoy horses, we call philepoi. Those who enjoy a show, a theama, we call philotheoroi. Man who takes pleasure in justice is called philodikaios. The one who likes virtuous deeds is philaritos. Now that context, loving noble aristocratic horses, loving justice, loving virtuous acts, and loving shows implies that it's very positive. Now, Aristotle wants tragedy that provides interesting moral examples and represents people doing their best to be good, but who are frustrated by misfortune or one-off mistakes. Because he regards women as less competent deliberators than men, and because he says explicitly he sees tragedy as representing how people deliberate, take decisions, and then act on them, he cannot find women as interesting as men as protagonists. He wants deliberation by good men, which may end up in a disastrous mistake, but he wants us to see it. But there is one quality in which his other works show that women can reveal a greater degree of virtue than men, and that is familial or parental love. In his Rhetoric, he addresses Antigone's famous speech when she says that she cared more for a brother than for a husband or children, for if the latter were lost, they could be replaced. But since my mother and father have passed away, no other brother can ever be born to me again. He admires Euripides' tragedy Iphigenia in Tauris, in which Iphigenia, who's very virtuous, love for her brother Orestes is by far the strongest instrumental emotion in the play. But the passage that most interests me is when it comes to women in tragedy is actually in his Eudemian Ethics. Here, Aristotle is very moving. He says the person who really loves you as a primary friend, which includes close relatives if they behave like friends, a primary friend will happily tolerate it if you don't even know they've done you a good turn, it just doesn't matter to them, because your well-being and flourishing is far more important than them getting credit, right? Their goal is not to prove anything to you or get credit or get anything in exchange. They just want your well-being. Good parents, he says, feel this kind of altruistic love for their children. In fact, he thinks it proper that fathers love their children more than children love their fathers. And then he says, mothers more so than fathers. He believes profoundly that the intensity of mother love is even greater than that fathers have for children. For, he says, people estimate work by its difficulty, the production of a child, the mother suffers more. And as his extreme example of selfless love, he offers mothers who allow their children to be adopted because they believe it's in the child's best interest. And he cites a tragedy, sadly, we have not got, in which Andromache, in order to save her son Astyanax's life when he was threatened with being cast from the walls of Troy by the Greeks, she tried to smuggle him out of the city in the hope that some other woman would find him and adopt him. Now, this would have meant being deprived of the baby herself. And moreover, since Astyanax was so tiny, he would not remember her. He would never have learned about the personal sacrifice she made on his behalf. He might even blame her for the rest of his life as having abandoned him. It doesn't matter to Andromache. So, Aristotle in his Poetics, I think I've got a picture of her somewhere. Can we find a picture of, yes, the right kind of woman in tragedy? Aristotle in his Poetics was encouraging would-be tragedians to write plays that would not only give pleasure to the members of a city-state, but encourage them to virtue, through which they would be more likely to live happily. Female virtue does not lie, he says, in physical, manly courage or in frightening capability, nor are females able to deliberate efficiently and therefore have civic leadership, so they don't make the most promising protagonists. But the area in which women undoubtedly excel and are better than men, the practice of family philia, is one in which he thinks certainly creates great material for tragedy, like Antigone. And this is especially so if combined with the sort of near-miss situation in which a mother or a sister nearly kills her son, like Merope, or her brother, like Iphigenia. It's also crucial to read Aristotle's remarks in the contexts, both of his work as responses to Plato and the context of his total project in his other treatises. Now, we may admire Clytemnestra and Medea and see them as courageous and brilliant individuals struggling against terrible patriarchal oppression. And that Aristotle does cite and quote from plays in which they appear, actually, I think, may tell us that he was less unsympathetic to their famous tragedies than his remarks in the Poetics might suggest. That's just a hunch. But most importantly, alongside them, we need to place his admiration for plays in which loyal mothers and sisters arouse the appropriate tragic emotions of pity and fear. Aristotle's thought is always more complex than it first appears, and we are so blessed still to be able to read and reflect both on 30 Greek tragedies and his radical ideas for revising its ethical program, not only for the pleasure, but the moral benefit of citizens. Thank you.